The skies over Europe in 1943 were a killing field. American B-17 flying fortresses, those massive four-engine bombers that were supposed to be invincible, were falling from the sky at an alarming rate. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than they could replace them, and the men who flew them were paying the ultimate price. But one mechanic working through a cold night in England was about to change everything. His name was Paul Christ, and he was about to prove that sometimes the best innovations don't come from engineers and laboratories, but from the men who actually work on the machines, the men who see the problems up close, the men who watch their friends take off and never come back. This is the story of how one man's unauthorized modification, done in complete defiance of regulations, became standard equipment on every B-17 flying fortress and saved countless lives. It's a story about ingenuity under pressure, about the difference between following orders and doing what's right, and about how the machinery of war is sometimes improved by those who refuse to accept that things can't be better. To understand what Paul Christ did, we need to understand the problem he was trying to solve. And to understand that problem, we need to go back to the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe in 1943. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was designed in the 1930s with a revolutionary concept. Unlike previous bombers that relied on speed or altitude to survive, the B-17 would bristle with machine guns, 1350 caliber Browning machine guns, positioned at strategic points around the aircraft, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make it nearly impossible for enemy fighters to attack without facing a wall of lead. That was the theory, anyway. The reality, as crews quickly discovered, was very different. The German Luftwaffe pilots, especially those flying the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, quickly figured out the B-17's weakness. They came in from the front, head-on attacks, closing at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour, giving the bomber crews just seconds to react. And when they came from the front, the B-17 had very limited defensive fire. Sure, there were guns in the nose, operated by the bombardier and navigator, but these were handheld guns, mounted on flexible mounts, difficult to aim accurately, while the aircraft was bouncing through flak and the fighter was closing at incredible speed. The guns could traverse side to side, but their coverage directly ahead was limited by the aircraft's structure. The result was predictable and horrifying. German pilots would approach from 12 o'clock high, slightly above the bomber's nose, and pour cannon and machine gun fire into the cockpit and forward fuselage. The pilot and co-pilot would be hit first. Then the fire would rake back through the navigator and bombardier positions. By the time the German fighter flashed past, the B-17's entire command crew could be gone. Mission after mission, the losses mounted. The 8th Air Force watched helplessly as their bombers were picked apart by these frontal attacks. Some missions saw loss rates of 20, even 30%. Entire bomb groups could be decimated in a single mission. The crews knew they were vulnerable. They could feel it every time they saw those enemy fighters lining up for a head-on pass. They knew that in those crucial seconds, their survival depended on two men in the nose, with handheld guns, trying to aim while the world exploded around them. Paul Christ watched this happen, mission after mission. He was a staff sergeant, a flight line mechanic with the 379th Bomb Group, based at Kimbolton, England. His job was to keep the B-17s flying, to patch up battle damage, replace engines, fix hydraulics. But more and more, his job became preparing bodies to be removed from aircraft, cleaning blood from cockpits, trying to make shot-up bombers airworthy for the next mission. He knew the men who flew these missions. He worked on their aircraft, talked to them before they took off, listened to their concerns, and he heard over and over the same complaint. We need more guns in the nose. We need something to stop those head-on attacks. The problem was, officially, there was no solution. Boeing's engineers had designed the nose of the B-17 with the existing gun positions, and that was it. The structure couldn't be modified without major redesign. Any changes would have to go through channels, be approved, tested, implemented at the factory. That would take months, maybe years, and men were dying now. Paul Christ decided he wasn't going to wait for Boeing's engineers to solve the problem. He was going to solve it himself. Now, understand what he was proposing. He was a sergeant, not an engineer. He had no authority to modify the design of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. He had no approval from his superiors, no technical drawings, no authorization from Boeing. What he was planning was, technically, sabotage. If it went wrong, if his modification caused a structural failure or interfered with the aircraft's operation, he could face a court-martial. But he'd also seen too many crews fail to come back. He'd cleaned too much blood from too many cockpits. He'd written letters home to too many families. At some point, following regulations becomes less important than saving lives. He began by studying the nose section of the B-17. The transparent plexiglass nose cone was the bombardier's station, filled with the complex Norden bomb sight, navigation equipment, and the existing gun mounts. There wasn't much room, and every structural element served a purpose. But Christ noticed something. Right in the center of the nose, there was a small section of framework that could potentially support additional weight. His idea was radical in its simplicity. Take a standard .50 caliber Browning machine gun. Mount it right in the center of the nose, pointing straight ahead, not on a flexible mount like the existing guns, but fixed in place. The gunner wouldn't traverse it side to side or up and down. It would point straight ahead, and that's it. When an enemy fighter came in from directly ahead, the gunner would simply fire. It sounds simple now, but at the time, it was unprecedented. Fixed forward-firing guns were for fighters, not bombers. Bombers had flexible guns that could track targets. A fixed gun seemed like a waste. But Christ understood something that the engineers didn't. When a fighter comes straight at you, you don't need to track it. You need to throw as much metal as possible straight ahead and hope you hit something. He also had another innovation. He would add not one gun, but two. One on the top of the nose, one on the bottom. The top gun would be operated by the bombardier, the bottom by the navigator, both pointing straight ahead. Together, they would create a corridor of fire directly in front of the aircraft that any attacking fighter would have to fly through. The challenge was making it work without having the proper tools, materials, or authorization. He needed to mount heavy machine guns in a position they were never designed to occupy, ensure they could withstand the stresses of flight and combat, and do it in a way that didn't compromise the aircraft's structural integrity or interfere with the crew's ability to use their other equipment. He started scrounging parts. The Air Force had plenty of .50 caliber Browning guns. Those were standard issue. He needed mounting brackets, reinforcement plates, ammunition feeds. Some of these he could requisition through normal channels. Others he had to improvise or, let's say, acquire through unofficial means. The military in wartime runs on official requisitions and unofficial trading. Christ was good at both. He worked at night after his regular duties were done. He couldn't work during the day because his commanding officer would have stopped him. What he was doing wasn't just unauthorized, it was potentially dangerous. If his modification failed during flight, if a gun broke loose or the mounting caused structural damage, an entire crew could be lost. And he would be responsible. But Christ was confident in his work. He'd been working on aircraft for years. He understood stress points, weight distribution, structural integrity. He wasn't some amateur with a wrench. He was a skilled mechanic who knew these aircraft inside and out. He believed his modification would work, and he was willing to stake his career on it. The first installation took him all night. He chose a B-17 that was in for routine maintenance, one that would be on the ground for a few days. He removed panels, reinforced the structure where needed, fabricated custom mounting brackets, installed the guns, ran the ammunition feeds, tested the mechanisms. By dawn, the work was done. 2 additional 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the nose, pointing straight ahead. The top gun, designated the chin turret position, would be operated by the bombardier. The bottom gun would be handled by the navigator, simple, straightforward, and potentially life-saving. But there was one problem. The aircraft's commanding officer, the pilot who would fly this modified B-17 on the next mission, had no idea this modification existed. Neither did the bombardier or navigator who would operate these guns, and neither did Krista's superior officers or anyone else in the command structure. When the crew arrived for pre-flight inspection the next morning, they were understandably surprised to find 2 extra machine guns in their aircraft. The pilot, a young lieutenant, immediately went looking for an explanation. Who authorized this modification? Was it safe? Had it been tested? What if it caused problems during flight? Christ met with the crew and explained what he'd done and why. The German fighters were tearing them apart with head-on attacks. The existing nose guns weren't enough. These additional fixed guns would give them a fighting chance. The bombardier and navigator would each have a trigger, and when a fighter came at them from the front, they'd just fire straight ahead. The pilot was skeptical. This wasn't standard equipment. It hadn't been tested. There were regulations against unauthorized modifications. But his bombardier and navigator were nodding enthusiastically. They were the ones who faced those head-on attacks with inadequate firepower. They were the ones who watched enemy fighters close in while their handheld guns couldn't track fast enough. The idea of having a fixed gun they could just point and shoot was enormously appealing. The pilot made a decision. He'd take the aircraft up on a test flight, see how it handled with the extra weight and different balance. If it flew okay, he'd take it on the next combat mission. If anything seemed wrong, he'd ground the aircraft and report the unauthorized modification. The test flight went perfectly. The additional guns added some weight to the nose, but the B-17 was a forgiving aircraft with plenty of power. The handling characteristics were virtually unchanged. The bombardier and navigator tested the guns, fired a few short bursts into the English Channel, and reported that they worked perfectly. The real test would come on the next combat mission. 3 days later, that modified B-17 lifted off from Kimbolton, along with dozens of other bombers, headed for a target deep in Nazi Germany. The mission would take them through some of the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, through gauntlets of anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. It was the kind of mission where bombers were expected not to return. As the formation droned deeper into enemy territory, the German fighters appeared first as distant specks, then as deadly predators circling the bomber formation, looking for the weak and the vulnerable. The Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s knew their business. They'd been doing this for years, and they knew exactly how to take down a B-17. They set up for their head-on attacks. 3 fighters line abreast, coming in from 12 o'clock high. Closing at incredible speed, their cannons and machine guns would open up at about 800 yards, and they'd hold their fire all the way in, then break away at the last second. It was a deadly game of chicken, and usually the bomber lost. The bombardier in Christ's modified B-17 saw them coming. In a standard aircraft, he would have grabbed his flexible mounted gun, tried to swing it to track the fighters, knowing he probably wouldn't get a good shot before they opened fire. But today, he had something different. He had a gun pointing straight ahead, and all he had to do was put the attacking fighters in his sights and pull the trigger. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. The fixed gun poured 50 caliber rounds straight ahead, creating a stream of tracers that the attacking fighters had to fly through. The navigator in the lower nose did the same with his gun, 2 streams of 50 caliber fire converging ahead of the bomber. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The lead German fighter, seeing the tracers coming straight at him, broke off his attack early. The 2 wing fighters pressed on, but they were flying into a wall of fire they hadn't expected. One took hits in the wing and engine, trailing smoke as it broke away. The other got his shots off, but was hit in return, his canopy shattering from the .50 caliber rounds. The attack that should have torn the B-17's nose apart had been defeated. The German fighters scattered, damaged, and demoralized. The bomber flew on, its crew intact, its mission continuing. When the formation returned to England, the crew of that modified B-17 couldn't stop talking about what had happened. The fixed nose guns had worked exactly as Christ had predicted. They'd driven off a head-on attack that probably would have ended them. The bombardier and navigator, who had felt so vulnerable before, now felt they had a fighting chance. Word spread quickly through the 379th Bomb Group. Other crews heard what had happened, and they wanted the same modification on their aircraft. Pilots who had been skeptical started asking when their B-17s could be modified. Chris suddenly found himself with more work than he could handle. But there was still the problem of authorization. What Christ had done was still technically against regulations. He'd modified a combat aircraft without permission, and that was serious. His commanding officer, Major Maurice Preston, had to decide what to do about it. Preston was in a difficult position. On one hand, regulations had been violated. Unauthorized modifications were forbidden for good reason. On the other hand, the modification clearly worked, and it was saving lives. He could court-martial Christ for disobeying orders, or he could look the other way and let him continue. Preston was, fortunately, the right kind of officer. He cared more about his men than about regulations. He'd seen the mission reports, heard the crew testimonials, and he understood what Christ's modification meant for the survival of his bomber crews. He made his decision. Not only would he not punish Christ, he would authorize him to continue the modifications on other aircraft in the group. Over the next few weeks, Christ and the mechanics who worked with him modified every B-17 in the 379th Bomb Group. It became a production line. They'd pull an aircraft off flight status, install the guns overnight, and have it back in service the next day. The work was demanding, but the mechanics knew they were saving lives, and that motivated them to work long hours in cold, uncomfortable conditions. The results were undeniable. Mission after mission, the modified B-17s demonstrated superior survival rates against frontal attacks. German fighter pilots, who had grown accustomed to attacking from the front with relative impunity, now found themselves facing concentrated fire from fixed guns that they couldn't evade. Some fighters were damaged or destroyed, others broke off their attacks early. The psychological effect was as important as the physical one. The German pilots became more cautious, less willing to press their attacks all the way in. Other bomb groups heard about the 379th's modifications and wanted the same for their aircraft. But there was a bureaucratic problem. The modification wasn't officially authorized by the 8th Air Force or by Boeing. Each group would need permission to implement it, and getting that permission meant going through channels, submitting requests, waiting for approvals. Some groups didn't wait. Their mechanics, hearing about what Christ had done, simply copied it. Unofficial modifications spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Group by group, B-17s acquired additional nose guns. It became an open secret that aircraft were being modified in the field without proper authorization. Eventually, the situation reached 8th Air Force headquarters. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, had to decide how to handle this widespread violation of regulations. He could crack down, order all unauthorized modifications removed, court-martial the mechanics who had installed them, or he could recognize that sometimes the men in the field know what they need better than headquarters does. Eaker was another officer of the right type. He understood that regulations existed to serve the mission, not the other way around. He looked at the mission reports, the survival statistics, the crew testimonials. He consulted with his intelligence officers about German tactics, and he made his decision. The modifications would not only be authorized retroactively, they would become standard. Every B-17 in the 8th Air Force would receive the additional nose guns. Furthermore, Eaker would contact Boeing and order them to install the guns at the factory on all new B-17s. What had started as one mechanic's unauthorized field modification would become an official part of the aircraft's design. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. When Boeing's engineers examined the field modifications, they were impressed by Christ's work, but they saw opportunities for improvement. Rather than having the guns operated manually by the bombardier and navigator, who already had other duties, why not create a powered turret, a gun mount that could rotate and elevate, giving better coverage and easier operation? The result was the chin turret, a powered gun position mounted under the nose of the B-17, containing two 50-caliber machine guns. It became standard equipment on the B-17G model, which entered service in mid-1943. The B-17G would become the most produced variant of the Flying Fortress, with over 8,600 built, and every single one of them had the chin turret that originated from Paul Christ's field modification. But we're getting ahead of the story. Let's go back to 1943, to the immediate aftermath of Christ's innovation, because the impact of those extra nose guns went far beyond just shooting down a few more German fighters. The addition of forward-firing guns fundamentally changed the tactical equation for both the bombers and the fighters. German fighter pilots, who had developed highly effective head-on attack tactics over years of combat, suddenly had to rethink their entire approach. The cost of pressing a frontal attack had gone up dramatically. Where before they might face scattered fire from handheld guns, they now faced concentrated fire from fixed guns that were much easier to aim and much more likely to hit. Some German units adapted by changing their tactics. They began attacking from different angles, from the sides or the rear, where the B-17 was still well defended, but where the nose guns couldn't reach. But these attacks were less effective. The side and rear of the B-17 had good defensive coverage, and approaching from these angles gave the bombers' gunners more time to track and engage the fighters. Other German units continued to press frontal attacks, but with greater caution. They would open fire from longer range, then break off earlier, trying to damage the bomber without exposing themselves to concentrated defensive fire. This reduced their effectiveness. Attacks from long range were less accurate, and breaking off early meant they weren't inflicting as much damage. The overall result was a measurable decrease in bomber losses. The 8th Air Force's statisticians tracked these numbers carefully, and they saw a clear correlation. Bomber groups that had installed the nose guns showed lower loss rates on missions than groups still flying with the original gun configuration. The difference wasn't enormous, but in the brutal mathematics of bomber warfare, even a few percentage points in survival rate meant the difference between hundreds of crews living or dying. Paul Christ became something of a legend in the 8th Air Force. He was promoted to technical sergeant, then to master sergeant. He received a commendation for his innovation, though the Army Air Force carefully worded it to avoid explicitly endorsing the violation of regulations. Other mechanics sought him out for advice on improving their aircraft. He became known as someone who could look at a problem and find a practical solution, even if that solution wasn't in the technical manuals. But Christ himself remained modest about his achievement. In later interviews, he would always emphasize that he wasn't some lone genius. He was part of a team, working with other mechanics, listening to feedback from the crews, trying different approaches until something worked. The innovation, he insisted, belonged to everyone who contributed to it. There's something profound in that modesty. Because the real story here isn't just about one mechanic and one modification. It's about a culture that allowed innovation to flourish, even when it meant bending the rules. It's about officers like Major Preston and General Eaker, who were willing to trust their subordinates and validate field innovations. It's about a military organization that, despite its love of regulations and procedures, was flexible enough to recognize when the men doing the actual fighting had found a better way. The contrast with other military organizations is stark. In many armies, unauthorized modifications would be strictly forbidden, and anyone attempting them would face severe punishment. The focus would be on maintaining standardization and following procedure, even if those procedures weren't optimal. Innovation would have to come from the top down, from engineers and planners far from the actual fighting. The American approach, at least in this case, was different. Innovation came from the bottom up. The mechanic who saw the problem found a solution. The crews who flew the missions validated it. The commanders who led them authorized it. The organization adopted it. This kind of flexibility gave the American military a significant advantage in the Second World War. But let's be clear about something. This flexibility wasn't universal, and it came with risks. For every Paul Christ whose unauthorized modification saved lives, there were probably others whose modifications caused problems. We don't hear about those because they didn't become famous. The mechanic whose improvised repair caused an aircraft to crash doesn't get written up in the history books. The difference, I think, is that Christ was competent. He knew what he was doing. He understood the aircraft, understood the problem, and found a solution that worked. His violation of regulations was justified because he had the skill to pull it off. A less competent mechanic, attempting the same kind of unauthorized modification, might have caused disaster. This raises an interesting question about military regulations in general. Regulations exist for good reasons. They're designed to prevent mistakes, ensure standardization, maintain safety. Following regulations is usually the smart thing to do, but regulations can also be inflexible, unable to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. In a rapidly evolving combat situation, waiting for approval to try something new might mean people die unnecessarily. The answer, perhaps, is that you need both. You need regulations to provide structure and prevent chaos, but you also need to cultivate a culture where competent people feel empowered to deviate from regulations when necessary, where commanders trust their subordinates to make good decisions, and where innovation is valued even when it doesn't follow proper procedure. The American military in the Second World War generally struck that balance pretty well. There was structure and discipline, but also flexibility and initiative. Men like Paul Christ could innovate because they operated in an environment that valued results over strict adherence to rules. Of course, there's also an element of timing here. In peacetime, unauthorized modifications to aircraft would be completely unacceptable. The risks would outweigh any potential benefits. But in wartime, when men are dying and every advantage matters, the calculation changes. Christ's modification might not have been approved in peacetime, but in the desperate circumstances of 1943, it was exactly what was needed. Let's talk more about those circumstances, because understanding the context makes Christ's achievement even more impressive. The year 1943 was a critical period for the Allied bombing campaign in Europe. The 8th Air Force had been building up its strength, and it was now capable of launching massive daylight raids deep into German territory. The theory was that heavily armed bomber formations could defend themselves without fighter escort, fighting their way to the target and back. The reality was proving this theory wrong. German fighters were taking a terrible toll on the bomber formations. The Luftwaffe had developed effective tactics, experienced pilots, and aircraft well-suited to bomber interception. They were shooting down American bombers faster than they could be replaced. Some missions saw catastrophic losses. The raid on Schweinfurt in August 1943 saw the 8th Air Force lose 36 bombers out of 230, a loss rate of over 15%. The second Schweinfurt raid in October was even worse, with 60 bombers lost and many more damaged. These loss rates were unsustainable. At that rate, the entire bomber force would be depleted in a matter of months. The 8th Air Force desperately needed solutions. They needed better fighter escorts, but the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't have the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany, and the P-51 Mustang wasn't yet available in large numbers. They needed better defensive tactics, but German fighters were adapting as fast as the bombers could. They needed any advantage they could get. In this context, Paul Christ's modification wasn't just a clever innovation, it was a potential lifesaver. Anything that improved bomber survival rates, even marginally, was worth trying. The fact that it violated regulations was almost irrelevant. Men were dying, and here was something that might help them survive. This desperation explains why the modification spread so quickly through the 8th Air Force. Crews didn't care that it wasn't officially authorized. They cared that it worked. Commanders didn't worry about regulations when they saw the mission results. They authorized more modifications because they wanted their men to come home. There is a lesson here about innovation under pressure. Sometimes the best innovations come not from careful planning and extensive testing, but from desperate improvisation. When the stakes are high and time is short, you don't have the luxury of following proper procedure. You try something, see if it works, and if it does, you use it. Paul Christ's modification worked because he understood the problem intimately. He had the skill to solve it, and he was willing to take the risk of breaking regulations. It spread because other mechanics recognized a good idea when they saw one, and commanders were willing to validate it. It became standard because the organization was flexible enough to adapt. All of these elements had to come together. If Christ hadn't had the skill, the modification wouldn't have worked. If other mechanics hadn't been willing to copy it, it wouldn't have spread. If commanders had been inflexible about regulations, it would have been shut down. If the organization hadn't been willing to learn from field experience, it wouldn't have become standard. The story of the B-17's nose guns is, in many ways, a case study in how innovation happens in large organizations. It's messy, it's unofficial, it violates rules, and it works. Then the organization catches up, formalizes the innovation, and everyone pretends it was planned all along. By the time Boeing started installing chin turrets on the B-17G, the original field modifications were already ancient history. The factory-installed turrets were much more sophisticated than Christ's simple fixed guns. They were powered, they could traverse and elevate, they were properly integrated into the aircraft's structure. They were, in every measurable way, superior to the field modifications. But they also wouldn't have existed without those field modifications. Boeing's engineers wouldn't have developed the chin turret if mechanics in England hadn't proven that additional nose armament was needed and effective. The formal innovation was built on the foundation of informal experimentation. This is worth emphasizing because there's often a tendency to give all the credit to the official innovators, the engineers, and designers whose names go on the patents and in the history books. Paul Christ's name is not well known outside of aviation history circles. Boeing's engineers are the ones who got credit for the chin turret. But the reality is that innovation is often a collaborative process, with field experience feeding back to informed design decisions. The B-17G, with its factory-installed chin turret, entered service in summer of 1943 and quickly became the dominant variant. It was more heavily armed than any previous version, with the chin turret complementing the already formidable defensive armament. German fighter pilots found these aircraft much more difficult to attack from any angle. The frontal attacks that had been so effective against earlier B-17 variants now became much more dangerous for the attackers. Combined with the introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts in early 1944, the improved defensive armament helped turn the tide of the air war over Europe. Bomber losses, while still significant, became more manageable. The 8th Air Force could sustain its operations without depleting its strength. The strategic bombing campaign could continue. It would be wrong to attribute this entirely to Paul Christ's modification. Many factors contributed to the eventual success of the bomber offensive. Better tactics, improved training, numerical superiority, fighter escorts, and declining German capability all played roles. But the nose guns were part of the solution. one piece of a complex puzzle. Still, it's worth considering what might have happened if Christ hadn't made his modification. Would someone else have come up with the same idea? Probably, eventually. But how many crews would have been lost in the meantime? How many missions would have failed? Innovation delayed is often opportunity lost. There's a counterfactual question worth pondering. What if Paul Christ had been a by-the-book mechanic who followed regulations strictly? What if he had identified the problem, but submitted a request through proper channels and waited for approval? The request would have gone to his commanding officer, who would have forwarded it up the chain. It would have eventually reached 8th Air Force Headquarters, where staff officers would have reviewed it. They might have approved it, or they might have rejected it, or more likely, they would have referred it to Boeing for engineering study. Boeing's engineers would have analyzed the proposal. They would have run stress calculations, considered weight and balance issues, thought about production implications. They might have concluded that fixed-nose guns were worth developing, or they might have decided the concept wasn't sound. Either way, the process would have taken months. Meanwhile, missions would have continued. Bombers would have kept taking losses from frontal attacks. Crews would have kept dying while bureaucracy ground slowly forward. By the time an official solution was implemented, hundreds of additional airmen might have been casualties. This is the cost of following procedure in wartime. Procedure is important, but so is speed. Paul Christ understood that the cost of inaction was measured in lives. So he acted without authorization, took the risk, and proved his concept worked. Only then did the bureaucracy catch up and formalize what he'd already demonstrated. This approach doesn't work for everything. Some problems require careful engineering and extensive testing. You can't improvise your way to a new bomber design or a new bomb sight. But for some problems, field innovation is not just acceptable, but necessary. The trick is knowing which problems fall into which category. Christ knew that his modification fell into the category where field innovation made sense. He wasn't changing the fundamental design of the aircraft. He wasn't adding new systems that would require extensive integration. He wasn't doing anything that would require months of testing. He was adding guns to existing mounts, using existing equipment, in a straightforward way that could be validated in a single combat mission. His judgment proved correct. The modification was simple enough to be safe, effective enough to be valuable, and practical enough to be widely implemented. If he'd tried something more complex or more radical, it might have failed. But he picked the right problem and the right solution. There's an interesting parallel here to innovation in other fields. In technology companies, there's often a tension between careful planning and rapid experimentation. Some people advocate for extensive design and testing before releasing anything. Others argue for rapid iteration, releasing minimally viable products and improving them based on user feedback. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. You need planning for complex systems, but you also need experimentation for things where the best approach isn't clear. Paul Christ's modification was, in a sense, an example of rapid iteration. He had an idea, he tried it, it worked, he refined it, others copied it, and eventually it became standard. This is agile development before agile development was a thing. Of course, the stakes in most technology development aren't life and death. A failed software experiment costs money and time, but nobody dies. Christ's experiment, if it had failed, could have cost lives. That's what made his decision to proceed without authorization so bold and so risky. He was betting his career and potentially his freedom on his judgment that the modification would work. If an aircraft had crashed because of his modification, he would have faced a court-martial for negligent homicide. The fact that he was willing to take that risk shows how strongly he believed in his solution and how seriously he took the problem he was trying to solve. This kind of initiative is hard to cultivate in an organization. You want people to follow regulations most of the time, but you also want them to know when it's acceptable to deviate. You want to encourage innovation, but you also want to maintain discipline. It's a difficult balance, and different organizations handle it differently. The 8th Air Force, at least in this instance, got the balance right. They allowed Christ enough freedom to innovate, but they also had structures in place to evaluate and adopt successful innovations. The chain of command was flexible enough to authorize field modifications when they proved effective, but also structured enough to ensure standards were maintained. This flexibility was characteristic of the American military in the Second World War. There are countless examples of field innovations that were adopted and became standard practice. From modified tanks to improvised fortifications to new tactical procedures, the American military showed a remarkable ability to learn and adapt. The German military, by contrast, was often more rigid. They had excellent equipment and well-trained soldiers, but they were less willing to deviate from doctrine. Innovations had to come from the top down, and field modifications were discouraged. This gave them consistency and standardization, but it also made them slower to adapt to changing circumstances. The Soviet military was somewhere in between. They had a top-down command structure that was very rigid in some ways, but they also showed a willingness to adopt field innovations when they proved effective. Soviet soldiers became famous for improvising solutions to problems, often using whatever materials were available. The British military was probably most similar to the American approach, with a tradition of allowing junior officers and non-commissioned officers considerable initiative. The British had their own examples of field innovations that became standard practice. So while Paul Christ's modification is an American story, it's also part of a broader pattern of how democratic militaries tend to operate. There's more room for individual initiative, more willingness to question authority when necessary, more flexibility in adapting to circumstances. These are cultural traits that translate into military effectiveness. None of this is to say that the American military was perfect or that field innovation always worked. There were plenty of failures, plenty of bad ideas that were tried and discarded, plenty of times when following regulations would have been better than trying something new. But the overall culture allowed for experimentation and rewarded success. Paul Christ benefited from operating in this culture. He had the freedom to try his modification because his organization valued initiative. He was supported by commanders who were willing to take risks on new ideas. He worked in an environment where field experience was taken seriously and where practical solutions were valued over theoretical perfection. After the war, Christ returned to civilian life and continued working as a mechanic. He rarely talked about his wartime innovation, and he resisted efforts to make him into a hero. When aviation historians discovered his story and tried to interview him, he was always modest and self-deprecating. It was just a simple fix, he would say. Anyone could have done it. I just happened to do it first. But that modesty shouldn't obscure the significance of what he accomplished. In a critical moment, when the 8th Air Force was taking unsustainable losses, he found a solution. His modification saved lives, improved bomber survival rates, and eventually became standard equipment. That's not nothing. The story of Paul Christ and the B-17 nose guns reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected places. It's not always the engineers in the laboratory or the planners at headquarters who solve problems. Sometimes it's the mechanic on the flight line, the person who sees the problem up close and has the practical knowledge to fix it. It also reminds us that rules and regulations, while important, shouldn't become so rigid that they prevent necessary adaptation. There has to be room for initiative, for experimentation, for trying things that aren't in the manual. Organizations that can't adapt, that can't learn from experience, that can't deviate from procedure when necessary, are at a disadvantage. And it reminds us that in wartime the stakes are high enough that sometimes you have to take risks. Following procedure might be safer for your career, but it might also cost lives. There are moments when doing the right thing requires breaking the rules, and you have to hope that your organization is wise enough to validate your decision after the fact. The B-17 Flying Fortress went on to become one of the most successful bombers of the Second World War. It flew in every theater, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, and brought home thousands of crews who might otherwise have been lost. The B-17G, with its chin turret derived from Paul Christ's modification, became the most produced and most capable variant. Every time one of those aircraft drove off a German fighter with fire from its nose guns, every time a crew survived a mission because they could defend against frontal attacks, that was Paul Christ's legacy. Not just his personally, of course. The factory-installed turrets were more sophisticated than his field modification, but they wouldn't have existed without his initial innovation. That's how progress often works. Someone has an idea and tries it. Others see it working and copy it. Eventually, the idea gets refined and improved and becomes standard. The original innovation might be crude, but it proves the concept, and that's what matters. In the end, the story of how one mechanic's field modification changed bomber defense isn't really about the technical details of mounting guns in an aircraft's nose. It's about recognizing problems, finding solutions, taking initiative, and building an organizational culture that allows innovation to flourish. Those lessons remain relevant long after the last B-17 flew its final mission. Innovation still comes from unexpected places. Good ideas still often violate established procedure. Organizations still need to balance structure with flexibility, discipline with initiative, standardization with adaptation. Paul Christ understood these things intuitively. He saw a problem, he knew how to fix it, and he fixed it regardless of what the regulations said. That kind of initiative, that willingness to take responsibility and take action, that's what makes the difference between organizations that succeed and those that fail. When the history of the Second World War is written, Paul Christ's name rarely appears. The focus is on generals and politicians, on major battles and strategic decisions. But the war was also won by thousands of individuals like Christ, people who did their jobs well, who found ways to improve things, who took initiative when it mattered. The bomber crews who flew the B-17s with those extra nose guns probably never knew who Paul Christ was, but they benefited from his innovation every time they faced a German fighter. Some of them came home because of those guns. Some of them lived long enough to have children and grandchildren. That's his real legacy. In a hangar in England on a cold night in 1943, a mechanic looked at a problem that was costing lives, and he decided to fix it. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for authorization. He just did the work, confident that if it worked, he'd be validated, and if it didn't, he'd face the consequences. It worked. Lives were saved. The innovation spread and became standard. And decades later, we remember his story as an example of how one person, in the right place, at the right time, with the right skills and the courage to use them, can make a difference. That's the story of how one mechanic's unauthorized field modification doubled the B-17's defensive guns and changed bomber defense forever. It's a story about innovation and initiative, about breaking rules for the right reasons, about practical solutions to desperate problems. It's a story worth remembering because these lessons never get old. Problems still need to be solved, rules still sometimes need to be broken, and innovation still comes from the people who are close enough to the problem to understand it and bold enough to try something new. Paul Christ was that kind of person. The crews who flew in his modified bombers were lucky to have him. The 8th Air Force was lucky to have him. And we're lucky to have his story as a reminder that sometimes the most important innovations come not from the expected places, but from the determined individual who simply refuses to accept that things can't be better.